Hi, everybody. I am doing our final lecture or two remotely, and so I hope that while you're sheltering in place, everyone is healthy and has all they need with them. And now you have this one next thing, which will be a short lecture covering sort of an example of some of the materials that I was going to show. So for our art heists lecture, I was going to start off by showing you the Isabel Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston, which is the site of the world's biggest art heist, which was a robbery that occurred, I believe, in the middle of the night, and what they got away with has not been recovered. So they broke in, and I believe that they tied up the guards, and they even had machine guns, I think. They had so much time they could have completely taken everything in the museum. What they did take were some of the most important paintings that that museum, and it is a large institution, had. One of them was this, The Concert, which is a painting by the Dutch artist Johan Vermeer. Vermeer is only known to have painted about 40 or so artworks that we know of. And this one is depicting a man and two women performing music. A lot of his scenes were depicted doing and showing the same kind of thing, because I think he had a setup in his studio in a hotel that he owned, because he was also a hotelier. That was sort of his main gig. And painting was not his way of making a living. Nevertheless, he painted these small and intimate paintings like this one, where he is showing a corner of the studio. He's very good at showing the parquet and tiled floor that recedes perfectly into the distance, and his crisp, ultra realistic rendering of line and color and form caused some people, like David Hockney, the contemporary artist, to accuse him of using a camera obscura, which is a non-mechanical visual aid that you can have them portable or large enough that you can get inside, and there's a pinhole, and it allows you to see the image that you're looking at reflected upside down on a piece of paper, and therefore would be able to draw out the lines perfectly. That isn't always supported by all art historians. Many of them just believe that Vermeer had a very great deal of accuracy for his rendition of line. Anyway, this painting is probably valued as one of the most, if not the most, valuable artwork ever stolen. It happened in 2015, and it was at the time valued at $250 million. They also got away with The Storm on the Galilee, a 1633 oil on canvas painting by Rembrandt. It's his only known seascape. This one depicting the miracle of Jesus calming the storm on the Sea of Galilee. It was a scene that's described in the 4th chapter of the Gospel of Mark. And so what we see is a tempestuous seascape where the boat is rocking wildly in the waves. And so, as you can see from the way that the mast is shown on a diagonal, Rembrandt is creating a very dynamic composition. Diagonals do that in compositions, and it's set against the sky in the background, where we see the sun is just starting to break through, as though we're seeing this moment that Jesus is just about to calm the sea. So they also got away with that painting, as well as The Lady and Gentleman in Black, which is another painting by Rembrandt. This from the sort of middle part of his career, painted around the same time as the painting we just looked at. This one has actually been debated by the Rembrandt Research Project that were running around in the 1980s, de-authenticating Rembrandt. So they believed that it was by the school of Rembrandt, maybe a a student or follower of Rembrandt, and that's never been fully authenticated. This is interesting because Rembrandt didn't do a lot of double portraits, because what we're seeing is a portrait of a couple in an interior, and it tends to be that Rembrandt's portraits don't show interiors. Like we see a map in the background and this chair with its back toward us in the foreground. Of course, they're in period costume, and the ruffles around the neck and that sort of thing is the kind of thing that Rembrandt or those artists would have picked out with lead white, and that's why they have such body. They're not sort of desperately shining through with light to blind us, but they have a kind of a subtle glowing quality, and he contrasts that in the seated lady against the dark background very well. The theft at the Gardner is still an ongoing investigation, and so the museum actually recognizes that on their own website by posting images of the gallery where the paintings were stolen, showing the empty canvas frames. So that's a case of one of the most important art museums in the world being robbed at sort of gunpoint. But there are other ways that museums get robbed all the time. Well, maybe not museums, but definitely artists. If we look at the artist Mark Rothko, who was one of the foremost painters in the 1950s, an abstract expressionist working in New York at that time. Abstract expressionism was a style of this all-over painting, as it's called, where there's no exact focal point. Another artist like that would be Jackson Pollock, but rather what Rothko, different than Pollock, was interested in was creating these massive color fields that would really cause the viewer to get into a space of contemplation with the painting. He made these very large, almost floor-to-ceiling paintings that he wanted in a way to explode the wall. Lighting of these in museums and in your home was not done with spotlight, because then that would create a focal point, but rather with this diffused light. And until Barnett Newman came along, Rothko was considered the foremost painter in the United States. Once he sort of came into his mature style, producing work like this, he continued on this way for several years until about 1970, when he committed suicide in February of that year. The year before that, he signed a deal with the Marlborough Gallery in New York that they would represent him, and he wouldn't sell any paintings except to them for 8 years. After he died in 1970, the gallery was able to get a hold of about 700 paintings, unsold paintings by Rothko, some of which he had left in his will to his children and his family. His wife died 6 months later. And so this Marlborough Gallery, with some of the executors of his estate, managed to, through illegal dealing and self-dealing, sell at a loss a lot of these paintings into their own hands, so that they could then turn around and make a profit by them. And it was a few years later that the Rothko estate, basically representing the children and the family of Rothko, sued the gallery and the executors, and the court case went on for, I think about 20 years, until it was finally realized. Back in the 1970s, just a few of these paintings, like the one we're seeing here, as well as I think maybe this one, maybe 3 or 4 of them were sold for $1.8 million. But the museum, the gallery, the Marlborough Gallery, was also acquiring at bargain basement prices most of the other work that they would then turn around and sell. So they were giving the estate very little money. At one point, they only gave them $200,000, but they were selling Rothko's by using themselves and their own associates as middlemen these same paintings in uh, uh, as a kind of a whole for something like $45 million. So that's another kind of theft. The Rothko work is challenging for some people to look at, but if you look very closely at it, you'll see that he's not, in fact, doing something simple like taking a brush and just spreading paint all over the canvas. That's what it looks like he's doing. But if you look carefully at it, there are so many complex layers that after a few minutes of looking, these hovering squares start to shimmer, and they even actually start to move. That's the relationship that they have with your eye. And if you stick with it long enough, and I've sat in front of these for as long as an hour, you can really get a pretty spiritual experience with these. And they're in museums all over the world. Whenever I have an opportunity, I definitely take it. Here's an example, something a little bit different, of a Robert Motherwell painting from around the same time, 1960s, 1970s, as the work we were just looking at by Rothko. Motherwell might also be considered one of these abstract expressionist painters. He's often sort of put in that group. And this one painted, I think, in 1978 or 1976. It was being transported by the Santini Moving Company, being sent to a gallery when it suspiciously went missing. And it didn't turn up for many years until in the hand of a private collector that it was noticed as being one of these stolen paintings. And when the owner figured it out, he called the FBI. Motherwell never titled his paintings, and so it makes it very difficult for them to be on a list of stolen paintings, say by the FBI or Interpol, because how can you put an untitled thing on a list? You could call it untitled, which is what it was called, but many artists call things that. So it makes it very difficult to find stolen work afterwards. Anyway, it was about 30 years on that this was discovered. And it was eventually returned to the Daedalus Foundation, which had been deeded it by the Motherwell estate, and so finally given back, and now it's on public view at the Daedalus Foundation. So he's one of these artists of the New York school. That's another way to think of the abstraction expressionists, as the New York school, because they were all working in New York. So I'm saving the best one to the last. This is Jerry and Rita Alter, who lived in a small New Mexico town called Cliff. In 1985, on Thanksgiving, they showed up to the University of Arizona Museum of Art in Tucson just as the gallery was open. Rita was distracting the guard with conversation while Jerry went upstairs, and then the two of them abruptly left, got in their car, and drove away. The guard was suspicious, went upstairs, and he saw that the William de Kooning painting that the museum owned, it was worth approximately $160 million, was missing from its frame. It wasn't discovered for another 30 years when it was in the home of the Alters. And at the time that the last of the couple died in the 2000s, kids who sold the house and all of its contents didn't know that the painting was extremely valuable. The person who bought it owned a small gallery in another little Midwestern town, and it wasn't until he put it up for sale on the wall in his store that some of the customers noticed that it might be a real de Kooning. What's very interesting about this is once the FBI took over and started to look into the Alters, they discovered that the couple had over $1 million in the bank. And Rita worked as a speech therapist for a local high school, and Jerry owned a small sort of book publishing business that they never made a lot of money at, but still they went on vacations every year and had an immense amount of money in the bank. So one must wonder what else they might have stolen over the years. So this brings us to the end of this particular lecture. I've got one more planned that's going to be talking about appropriation, and I hope that you enjoy that. I'm looking forward to seeing you all again in the future, and I hope that we can get together over better circumstances face to face. Stay well.